Hello neighbors, it's Brad here at eTrailer, and today we're taking a look and installing the Air Lift LoadLifter 5000 Ultimate Rear Helper Airbags on a 2023 Toyota Tundra. Newer trucks these days are built with comfort in mind. They can still tow a decent amount, but a lot of times they're set up for passengers and driver comfort, as most people aren't always towing. But when you start to tow, you'll start to see the shortcomings of that comfort, as it is a trade-off. And the reason being is factory suspension. That comfort comes from being able to have a lot of movement or squat. And when you have a trailer and it's squatting, it's not so great because it takes away from steering feel, braking, and it's also going to cause premature wear on your suspension. The reason being is the factory jounce bumper, which we have here, that sits on the frame. You can see the gap just from our axle to our jounce bumper. It's massive gap, and it takes all of that compression of your shocks for this to bottom out. And it's rare that you're really gonna bottom it out, but all the while it's gonna sag, and that's gonna make it to where your factory shocks really just won't have that stroke that they need as they're compressed. And that's just gonna make for, again, wearing out your suspension early. And that's why when you have that load and you're driving around, it gets a little bit squirrely up front. So putting a bag in the back to raise that up is gonna make the truck feel a little bit tougher. You're not gonna gain any capacity as far as towing, but it's just gonna feel like it's a little bit more ready to jump in and haul that weight without dragging behind. And that's where airbags really fill the void, literally by filling that gap up, but also having adjustability. There's plenty of other suspension enhancements that you can add to most trucks, whether it be a Timrin, a Sumo Spring, or something along those lines. Those work great, don't get me wrong. But if you're towing a multiple different trailers, it's really nice to have adjustability. That way you can custom dial it in to whatever you're hauling. Now, if you're concerned that the bags are going to be a little bit too squishy and you're going to not have that jounce bumper, not to worry. These Ultimates have a jounce bumper built into the bag, so those are still going to prevent you from being able to sag even with hardly any pressure. Now, it's always recommended to have at least 5 psi in the bags. That's just going to keep that structural rigidity, but they can go all the way up to 100 psi. So that's a huge range, and just a 10 psi difference makes a huge difference on the vehicle. And that's the cool part. You can put the trailer on that you normally tow, and if you change the load or you go to a heavier trailer, you just bump a little bit more pressure in the bags, and then you're ready to rock. Now, this one from the kit that you're going to get is set up for a dual path system, meaning you're going to have individual control of each bag. It's just its own manual Schrader valve per bag. You can make it a single path by getting a T-union fitting. It's not included, but you can pick that up here at eTrailer. If you want to just fill it on one valve and have equal pressure, that's a great way to do it. But having side-to-side adjustability with the dual path is nice if you have off-center loads, or if you're at a campsite and maybe you have a rooftop or a ladder rack tent on here, as that's becoming more and more popular. As you adjust that pressure, you can get that nice and level however you want it. Now, if you do want to add an air compressor to your system, no problem. We have our Wireless One EZ compressor from Air Lift, and it works great. Super easy install, and that way you're not having to manually fill. Now, with this compressor system in particular, it's going to make it a single path, so that's something that you're going to want to take in consideration. If you do want to maintain that dual path, you might want to look at a different compressor, but for a single path, this is the one that I would recommend. Makes it super easy to adjust pressure at the push of a button from your remote or your cell phone. As the name LoadLifter 5000 implies, 5,000 pounds is going to be the load capacity that you can put on these. Again, this is not going to give you extra capacity, but that's what it can handle. And the 5,000, that's pretty heavy duty. A lot of times you're going to see that more so on 3/4 ton trucks and 1 ton trucks, but the Tundra kind of falls into an interesting category because it seems like it's a little heavier duty than your typical half ton, but it's definitely not a 3/4 ton. So our neighbor today uses this on the farm to haul a bunch of different trailers. So these are going to be an awesome option for him. Now, as far as the installation goes, it's really nice. There's no drilling required. Everything just kind of bolts up around the frame and around the axle, goes together super easy. It's not too terribly hard to do. Sometimes the space gets a little bit tight under here, especially if you're doing this at home in your driveway or garage, but overall it's pretty easy to do. I'll walk you through all the steps to make sure we get it installed. So let's take a look at the installation. To begin our installation, the first thing that I like to do is get our spare tire lowered down and out of the way. It's just going to give us a lot more space to be able to work underneath the truck and get everything into place. So go ahead and get yours lowered down as well. And with our spare tire out of the way, we're going to go ahead and get our jounce bumpers removed. And there's just going to be a total of 3 bolts on each side. And you'll see that 2 of them go directly into the frame from the bottom. There's also going to be 1 on the side. So go ahead, get these removed. And to get these taken off, it's just going to be a 12mm socket. Now on each side of the frame rails, we're going to be removing these plastic caps, and this one's just right by the coil of our spring, and you're just going to take a flathead screwdriver and just kind of pry this out. And if you need to, for the other side, what you can do is just kind of poke your screwdriver through and pop that out. And just make sure you do that on both sides of the truck. Now just on our passenger side, we're also going to go to the outside of the frame rail. You can kind of go in the wheel well opening, and there's going to be this module that's attached by these 2 12mm bolts. So we'll go ahead and get these removed. And once we get this hardware out, this module is going to be loose. So we'll set this aside for now. We're going to be obviously around the spot around the frame that we're going to be bolting this up. So if you need to, you can just rest your module off to the side. We're going to get our frame brackets installed on both sides of the truck. These are not side specific, but there is a proper orientation to get these in place. You'll see that you have these wider holes and more narrow ones. The wider ones are going to go towards the front of the vehicle, and this gusseted kind of opening here is going to be on the outside of the frame rail. So we'll be using the slotted holes in our button head cap screws just to thread this in where we had our jounce bumpers originally. So we're not going to completely tighten these down. We want to be able to still slide this for a little bit of adjustability when we get the rest of the bag portion up. And just to kind of hand tighten these in is going to be good. If you need a little bit of extra help, you can use a 5mm Allen wrench here. So I'll get these started, but once I get a little bit closer with those threads in, I'm going to double check. We should be able to slide this back and forth. So I think at this point, I'm pretty happy with this. We'll go ahead and get the other side put in as well. Now we're going to grab the brackets that look like this. These are side specific, and you'll see that this has an R on it. The other one's going to be an L. So being on the passenger side, we'll take the right side, and this is going to sit on top of that plate we just put in place. You can see that the holes are going to match up with that, and that's kind of what we're looking to do here. And we're going to rest this bracket on our plate and try to get those holes aligned. And what we're going to be doing is, as we tighten it up, you'll see this inner bracket that should align with the hole on the frame. It just kind of, as I press it against, you can kind of tell when it seats up nice and perfect. And what we're going to do is raise up that bottom plate with that 5mm Allen wrench. Now we're going to be wanting to torque these down, so you might need a bit with that 5mm and a torque wrench. I'll go underneath, start torquing that down, and then double check up here that everything's nice and aligned. Now if you want to be a little more precise when doing this, something that you can do to keep the bracket holes aligned is just take 4 of the carriage bolts. We're just going to loosely drop them in there, and that way those holes stay aligned. Make it a little bit easier, so that way as we tighten, all we have to do is focus on that one hole lining up with the bracket. And you'll see, obviously, we still have that sliding available because these aren't tightened down. So what I'm going to do is just kind of get this bracket centered up with that hole, get that reference, and I'm going to start snugging it down just with the Allen wrench first, and then double check up top that it's sitting exactly where we want it before getting our torque wrench. And as I tighten this down, I'm going to just go one side and then the other. And I'm not going to go too tight. I'll go double check the hole on the side. And I'm happy with the alignment. It's lining up in the slotted holes. So with our button head screws kind of tightened down, I'll go back down with my torque wrench, and using the torque settings found in the instruction manual, we'll get those torqued down. Now once that's torqued down, we can actually remove our bracket and set this aside for now. It might be a little tight here, but I'll push our carriage bolts out and it'll make it a lot easier. Now on each side, we need to remove the bolt that has our parking brake cable attached to it. It's just going to be located slightly on the front of the axle on each side. So right by the sway bar, just kind of look for that. And it's going to be a 12mm socket. We'll just get that removed. And then we'll just set this off to the side. We'll maintain our hardware for now. Now we'll begin the assembly of the bags. And the first thing we're going to do is grab our push connect air fittings. And we'll find the one side of the bag that has the 3 brass fittings, and you'll see the one that's obviously open for the air to go in. So what I'll do is I'm just going to start this by hand. And once that bottoms out, we'll just come back with a 1/2-inch wrench. And we're going to tighten this down 1.5 turns. With brass fittings, tighter's not always better. In fact, a lot of times it's worse. So kind of just get yourself a reference point, and then we'll rotate this the 1.5 times. 1, there's a 1/2. We'll do it to the other as well. Now grab 2 roll plates and just drop these into place. Now we'll take each of these plates and we're going to put 2 carriage bolts through here. So have one of them by the notch here, and then the other one's going to be on the inside hole. So stay away from the outside carriage bolts for now. And we'll just place this on here. And then you'll have the bag where we have these oiled button head cap screws. We're going to take that and we'll thread these through the plate, the roll plate, and then eventually into those brass fittings. And we can tighten down our button head screws, and we're going to be torquing these down to the instruction manual torque specifications. Now with these, it's not going to be the same 5mm that we used for those frame plates that we put on. I'm going to be using a 7/32 to get these torqued down. So swap that out and then torque them both down. Now we'll go ahead, we'll get the other side set up just the same way. Now when also doing your other bracket, just make sure that you're mirroring it with the notch, so that way we'll have a left side and a right side. So I just put my notches kind of towards the middle there. The rest of it's going to be exactly the same. Now we'll flip these over and just keep track of which side your air fitting is on. So mine's going to be facing towards me when I have these flipped, because when we put our second bracket on, we're going to want to make sure that we have the carriage bolts on the same side. So when putting your bottom roll plates on, you'll just make sure, air fittings on this side, you'll have the opening. It'll go just like that. And then with our bracket, take the long carriage bolts, and you'll see there's this little notch here for the head of the bolt to sit in. And as I mentioned, this is going to go on the same side as the air fitting, so just kind of get that aligned. And then we'll get our button head cap screws in place and torque down to the same torque setting that we just did on the other side. And to double check that everything's aligned properly, the side with this notch should be towards this long bracket here, so the air fitting will be on the opposite side of our tabs. This is going to be our left assembly, and this is going to be our right. So keep those specific. That way when we put it up, we have the right assembly for the correct side. To make room for our assemblies to go in place, we're going to want to raise up the suspension of the truck while keeping the tire still on the ground. So we're obviously on a lift, so I'll be using a trans jack, but at home you can just chalk your front tires and use a floor jack on the hitch of your vehicle and just raise it up, and you'll see that suspension become unsprung. Now something that I'll recommend doing before getting your assembly in place is grabbing that bracket that we previously had, and we're going to put this in place just loosely with our flange bolt. and this is just going to thread into those holes that we were originally using for alignment. So we'll raise this and put it in place. That way when we put our bag assembly in, we can get the carriage bolts to pass through the holes on this bracket as well. And just a few threads here to get it started, and this will just again hold it in place, because as we put our bottom assembly in, we're going to want this in first, otherwise you really can't slide this into place. So with that kind of threaded on, I can still move this around to be able to align the holes on the bottom as I put the assembly in. Now when raising this in place, it's going to be pretty tall here. You can compress the bag, and if you just kind of hold your hand or put a plug in the, you can put a piece of the airline tube in here. Once you sandwich it, it can hold that in place for you. So I actually have a tool that I use for that reason in particular, because it is pretty tight. But as we raise this up, this squared portion is going to sit on the squared portion of the axle, and we want to make sure that our long carriage bolts are going to be passed in between the axle and this hard line, and then also that line that we loosened up earlier. Just make sure that this is on the outside of the carriage bolt. So I'll try to slide this in here, and you'll see that it's pretty tight here. So I am going to squish this down and put my fitting in place to save us a little space. Now go ahead and you can get your other assembly in. I'm going to release the pressure on here, and that way we can lower down our truck so we can get everything bolted together. And as we lower it down, we're going to try to get our carriage bolts to go in the inside middle holes here. So as this slides up, or as we lower the truck down, just make sure all the brackets are aligned so we can get that stud passed through. Now we'll grab 2 serrated flange nuts, and with this kind of seating properly, we'll get these started on this bracket. Make sure that it's passed through both of them, or all 3 of them, I should say. And if it's kind of stuck in this position to where you can't get those threads up, you can just take a screwdriver and kind of wedge this until it pops up, and that'll make it a little bit easier to get those started. We'll do that on the front and back side, and we'll do both sides of the vehicle. And we're going to leave this a little bit loose here. We just need to get those nuts started. Now, with those in place, we're going to take 2 more carriage bolts, and those are just going to pass up in the remaining holes. So do the same thing and get your hardware started. We're going to be torquing down the bolt that goes in horizontally into the frame, that flange bolt. It's going to be a 13mm socket to accomplish that. And this torque setting is going to be different than the carriage bolts, and also it's going to be a different socket, but I would recommend having a 14mm socket ready for that. But for now, we'll get our 13 on here and get this torqued down properly. Now we'll go through and we'll get these torqued down. Now the ones that are kind of tucked back here are going to be really hard to get to. Even with the crow's foot attachment, it might be tricky. But what I recommend doing is getting these outside ones torqued, and then grab I would say a ratcheting wrench, or just a wrench that's going to be a 14mm. And we're going to try to tighten these down accordingly. Just kind of gauge it based off your torque wrench on these and get this pretty close. I just don't see a really great option for us getting a crow's foot attachment in here. Now we're going to get our module put back in place that we previously removed on the passenger side. So there's a hole here on our bracket, and that's going to allow us to get this lined up. So as we kind of put this edge towards the end of the bracket, that's going to make for a nice mounting spot. Now we're going to use the factory bolt, and we'll pass that through. And then on the back side we have a flat washer and then a nylon lock nut. So we'll get that started. And there is a torque setting associated with this. So we'll have a 12mm socket on the head of the bolt and a 13mm wrench on the nut as we torque this down. Now we'll just need to get our axle cradle around the axle, and you'll see that this is the squared off portion and then it's rounded. Squared off portion goes towards the middle of the truck, And now's a good time to also check if your hard lines or that soft line should be out of the way since we loosened that up. But if this hard line's in the way, or even if you put the carriage bolt on the outside, not to worry. You can actually take this bracket off, flip it, and it'll draw it closer to the axle. If it's on the outside like this, what you can do is just put a little bit of pressure and slightly bend this out. Now be careful not to cause any major kinks, but the main thing is we don't have chafing going on with the threads on our brake line. So I'll take our cradle here, we'll just slide this through both of the carriage bolts and just kind of press this up against the axle. It should kind of flatten out, and that's kind of what we're looking for. We'll then take our flat washer, and then we have a nylon lock nut. We'll just thread that on both sides for now. And we're going to be using a 9/16 deep socket to draw these up a little bit closer. And once they start to bottom out, let off because we'll take the torque wrench to it. But the goal here is to evenly distribute the pressure. So we'll do a little bit on each one as we go. And once it's fairly even and this slack is gone, then we'll take our torque wrench and torque these down. Now those brake lines that we previously removed, you'll see that there's a tab on our bracket. And so we're going to get these bolted up, and I'm going to put this on the bottom side to give us just make sure it's not going to be rubbing against our bag. And the way we're going to get this tightened down is going to be the factory bolt pass through here. And then we'll take a flat washer and a nylon lock nut, and then we can tighten that down. So we've officially installed our bag assemblies. All that's left to do is get our air lines ran. And something that I'll recommend is I would grab both your Schrader valves and find where you want to mount it up first. You can either drill it through the plastic by the license plate. I'm going to be using a bracket. Later on, we're going to be putting a compressor on here, so I'm going to just temporarily mount this up to show you a dual path system. And maybe something you might want to consider if you want a single path system, you can pick up a push connect T union, and that way you can just jump her into one Schrader valve and it'll evenly distribute the pressure. I'll probably just mount my bracket here. And as far as any bracket, or if you're drilling into the plastic, there is a certain way that we'll have to get the hardware set up on the Schrader valve. First thing we'll do is take our nuts and we'll just bump these all the way back. And these are going to be for adjusting how much Schrader valve sticks through. Normally if you're drilling through plastic, you're going to want them bottomed out anyway. I prefer to have just a little bit more thread to be able to get an air chuck on there. It's up to you though. You can always adjust this after the fact. But once you have those in place, you'll put your star washer on each of them. And then you'll pass these through, whether you're drilling through the plastic or using a bracket like we have here. And then we're going to put our rubber washer over them. And then we'll put our flat washer and then follow it up with the other hex nut. And you don't need to crank it down too terribly tight. I believe these to be a 13 millimeter, so if you want to just take a socket by hand and tighten that down, you can go ahead and do that. But having this mounted or put in the location where you want these mounted, I think makes it a lot easier to get your air lines ran without shortchanging yourself. And if you have extra, that's not a big deal. So I think we'll get these in place, and then from here we'll be able to determine exactly the middle of our line and cut from there. Style of bracket that I have, I'm just going to remove this factory 10 millimeter bolt here on the bottom of the bumper. I think this will be a good spot too, because generally if you're filling them up and you're hooked up to a trailer, if you're on the driver's side, it's nice to have your fittings here, and it's going to be easily accessible to be able to fill them up. So while we have this loop, it's kind of easy to determine, we'll be running this along the frame, and just make sure that you have enough to get to the fitting, and you can also leave yourself a little bit of extra. Any excess we can actually loop around, so it's not a big deal. And when cutting the airline tube, I recommend using a tubing cutter. It's going to give you a nice clean square cut, which is going to be better long term in a push connect fitting. It's going to cut down on the potential for leaks. So I'll get these routed up and zip tied up accordingly, just making sure to stay away from any exhaust or moving parts. And so I'll get this routed and then show you exactly how it looks. I got our lines routed, and something that you're going to want to do, obviously, in a dual path configuration is make sure that your left and right are going to match the side of the truck that the airline's running to on the bag. So we'll start here for our passenger side bag. I just routed this up, and there's actually a few good spots along where the license plate kind of sits for a wire loom that's from the factory, and you'll just zip tie it up. I did end up having extra, and so I ended up making a loop here. And that's really nice because if you ever need to tie into this with a compressor later, or if you need to make another cut to get a better connection, whatever it may be, it's nice to have that extra there. From here, I just followed along the frame rail, zip tying it up to some factory wire loom before making my way over and pushing it into the push connect fitting on the bag. Now, when you press those in, you're going to get a little resistance. Push it a little bit further and you should feel it kind of drop into place. From there, just give it a quick tug. It should be locked in. And if you do need to remove it for whatever reason, there's a collar on the push connect fitting. You'll just simply push the airline down, hold the collar, and then pull that airline out. On the driver's side, this is a little easier one to run. We just kind of looped this up by the frame rail here and then made my way down to that push connect fitting. Once you have everything routed and zip tied up, we need to put some air in the bags and check for leaks. I'm going to just put about 30 PSI in here. And that's going to give me enough to where we can definitely determine if it's going to be leaking or not. So the first thing that we're going to check for is audible leaks, but we're also going to be taking a soapy water solution and spraying down on all our push connect fittings, and that's really going to show us if there's any small leaks that maybe we can't hear, but over time, you're going to drop pressure in the bags if you don't take care of it. So soapy water, just spray it all over the push connect fitting, and if it does start to create large bubbles, that's a good sign that you have a leak. So what you'll want to do is bleed out any of the pressure that's in the bag and then disconnect that airline from the push connect fitting, and you can try to reseat it. If not, the best thing you're going to want to do is recut it, get a nice clean connection, and try again. Now, once you determine that there's no leaks, you've officially installed your airbags. All that's left to do is just put whatever pressure you want in the bags according to whatever you're going to be towing. And if you're not going to be towing anything and you want a nice, comfortable ride, you're going to want to always maintain 5 PSI in these bags no matter what, just for structural integrity. Other than that, you can start enjoying the lack of sag that you're going to have with your airbags. And that was a look and installation of the Air Lift LoadLifter 5000 Ultimate Rear Air Helper Bags on a 2023 Toyota Tundra.